is with great pride and pleasure that I introduce to you David Bernhardt, the former Secretary of the Interior. Let's give him a big hand.
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, for those of you that don't know, Mike Sampson was my speech teacher in high school. So if this speech is very disappointing, there is one person that you should talk to about it, okay? And truthfully, Mr. Sampson, thank you so much for inviting me here today. I don't do a lot of public speaking anymore, and I wanted to do this because I'm from here. And I'm so grateful that Scott McInnes is here. I'm not sure where he's at. He's probably fled. But I was the luckiest person in the world. I got to grow up here. I actually went to elementary school in Newcastle, at the old Newcastle Elementary, and then at the new Newcastle Elementary. Did junior high at Newcastle, and then went to high school in Greeley. Left at the end of 11th grade and got my GED and went to UNC. And this community is so special. I ended up working for Russell George, and I got a great job of driving Scott McInnes around on the summer of his first congressional campaign. And what an education that was, let me tell you. I learned more about useless information than you can imagine. But Scott won, and I was in law school in DC, and he hired me as a part-time employee, and I was there for 5.5 years. He couldn't get rid of me. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experiences in government. And I had the opportunity to serve in the Bush administration. After serving for Scott, I went into private law practice. And a lady named Gail Norton became the Secretary of the Interior, and she worked at my law firm. She was packing up her briefcase and her coffee cup, and she said, "You want to go to the Department of the Interior?" And I wasn't quite sure about that. So I went and asked a big lobbyist around town what he thought about that. And he's like, "Oh, that'd be the worst decision you could ever make in your life. Don't go to Interior, it's a tar pit." And then I called Russell George. And I said, "What do you think about going to the Department of the Interior?" And he said, "Oh, that would be the greatest thing ever. You should go." And I went thinking I'd do it for a year, and I stayed for 8. And I started out as a low-level staffer and eventually became the Solicitor General. So the Solicitor of the Department. And then the Bush administration ended. I went back into private practice, thinking that my public service was done and I'd done enough. And I had the magical opportunity to work on the Romney transition team, which is functionally the equivalent of playing Model UN in high school. So I did that, and because of that, I ended up serving on the transition team. I was asked to, because I'd done the Romney team, when they were looking for somebody to do the Trump transition, they called me because I'd already done it, theoretically. And I was actually hunting in Steamboat Springs on the evening of the 2016 election. And about at 8 o'clock at night, I realized, ooh, I have a 1 o'clock meeting in DC at the transition headquarters. And so I hot-tailed it down to Denver, and my mom lives in Greeley, and I actually put my rifle on her porch with a little note that said, "Please store carefully," and headed to DC for my first transition meeting. And the reason I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a transition is I'll tell you what we went through, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Biden transition. What do you do in a transition? Well, what we did is I took every speech that President Trump had given as a candidate and looked at those and came up with a plan. There was about 12 of us. We developed a plan of what we would do hypothetically if as a model for what you might do as President Trump. And in doing that for Interior, he had a few core principles. He wanted energy independence. He wanted to further that effort. He wanted to further some conservation stewardship goals. And then we met with the prospective secretary, a guy named Ryan Zinke, and laid out a plan, and he liked it, wanted a little more reorganization in it. And then a transition occurs. There's a inaugural, and somebody decides what they want to do with the plan. And our strategy was to do as follows. The president would issue an executive order on an issue, let's say energy independence, and that would be followed by a secretarial order at the Department of the Interior to drive policy forward. And it was my experience in the Bush administration that we wasted about the first year waiting to figure out what our policies would be and getting the people to do them. And in a transition with nominations, it can take up to a year to get your nominees through the FBI and through the US Senate. In the Bush administration, there's a lot of argument about who should be the nominees, and I told the Secretary nominee Zinke that he should expect that, and I was completely wrong. Trump had a very different management approach, and basically, if Secretary Zinke wanted a person and he thought he should have him, the president was inclined to find a way to get that person. Trump's view of government was, in terms of effectuating change, was I'm going to give the agency head some goals, and I'm going to, if he tells me what he needs, I'm going to back, or her, I'm going to back them up and try and give them an opportunity to succeed, and that's exactly what he did, and that certainly was my experience. So we had a vision of what we'd do with energy. Some of it was expanding access, like opening the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Some of it was simply improving processes that existed, improving the number of days it would take to get an APD at the federal level. And those were the metrics that we worked on. Simple things like changing the surname process to move documents to the Federal Register quicker. So it was a range of things. And I give you that context to talk a little bit about the Biden administration. Because political appointees, at the end of the day, are agents of change. And elections have consequences. And when I look at the Biden administration, from my perspective, it seems to me that the candidate was very clear in his policy vision on matters related to the Department of the Interior. It was crystal clear in the campaign. In the transition, the Biden administration got a tremendous amount of help. If you were to look at, if you were to Google, you'd see there's proposals for dealing with the transition from Harvard Law School students, Berkeley Law School students, every law professor you can think of, everything you need to do to undo the Trump administration. And they had a broad net of people that they looked at. I think at Interior, our transition team in the Trump administration had about 12 people. So they had a very active transition team. Their appointees have been people who fundamentally agree with the president and believe in the president, and they've been aggressive in their nominations. The director of the Bureau of Land Management, Tracy Stone Manning, she previously had an immunity agreement to testify in a criminal trial. After an FBI background check and knowing that, that's a pretty significant choice to make a decision to nominate that person to lead an agency, and they got her confirmed. Martha Williams, very nice person, is the first head of the Fish and Wildlife Service who doesn't meet the statutory qualifications that Congress placed on that position. And so that's an aggressive nomination. Doesn't mean they're good or bad people, but those are forward-leaning choices as part of an administration. And their policies have been consistent so far with their vision. I'll give you a couple examples. I believe that in December of 2020, BLM processed on federal land 864 APDs. Might have been 865, but 864. In December of 2021, BLM processed 164 APDs. That's an 80% reduction. There were 4,600 APDs pending. So it wasn't like there weren't APDs to process. And there were, presumably, the same staff working. So in January of 2022, for federal lands only, they processed 95. That is, just as a pure analysis, pretty good work on the implementing the president's vision. And the big surprises for me of the Biden administration have been a couple. The willingness to move forward with the Nord Stream pipeline was interesting in that my view was, if you have a policy vision that says, look, we're hostile in this sphere, it's a hard argument to make that we're supportive of it in other places. And then that was followed up by public requests to Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. And that begins to create a tough policy ground to manage, I think. But that's where things are. Now, what's the other wild card, in my opinion? Obviously, they face a challenge as it relates to the price of gasoline and inflation. I served in the Bush administration in 2008, and that's the last time gas was at an average of over $4 a gallon nationwide. And I can assure you that at that time, the White House was asking us to think and propose every single idea we could to them to do something. And, and we did a lot of suggesting, and ultimately, the action the president took, and 2008 is interesting because at that time, the federal government's view was that the future of energy was a series of LNG import facilities. LNG import facilities. I could show you PowerPoints from Alan Greenspan saying this is the future of energy, and up and down both coasts are LNG import facilities. President Bush ultimately made a decision to lift a presidential withdrawal on the Outer Continental Shelf as a significant action item. In reality, you know this better than I, but in reality what happened with energy is technology had advanced, entrepreneurs advanced, and we had the shale revolution that we had. Very little to do with government policy at the end of the day. And so that will be a challenge for them. How will they deal with it? And so when I look just analytically at their campaign promises, their actions on day one with the Keystone Pipeline, their executive orders that were clear, just as we did, just as President Trump did, clear executive order to drive action. My takeaways are the president, as a candidate, was very clear on his policy direction. He's now filled his administration with aggressive administrative employees. And it's very unlikely that they will deviate from their political position. And so what that says to me is absent a real surprising groundswell, and I think that groundswell would have to be like Democratic governors and Democratic senators. Absent a big groundswell, you shouldn't expect any change of position, which is absolutely fine because he ran on that position. But that is my view of what is most likely. Now, here's the question for local government. And I became involved in public policy because I grew up here, and in 1982 they had an interesting experience. And that experience had a big impact on our community. And you know, folks decided to move on with their economic opportunities, and the community had to deal with that. And as I look at government today, the real question I have is who speaks at the end of the day, who speaks out for the future of the local communities? And the reason I ask that is when I went through my confirmation process as secretary, I had the good chance to sit down with Chuck Schumer, majority leader of the Senate. And he said, well, you know, you're too pro-industry. I said, I'm not pro-industry, but I am pro-opportunity of communities. And he said, what are you talking about? And I explained to him that from my perspective, areas of land, communities that were placed in areas that are surrounded by federal land must have an opportunity to have a chance to have a bright future. And that often depends on activities that happen on surrounding federal lands. And his response to me was this: there are not very many people in those places. And I said, well, those people have the same hopes and dreams somebody walking in Central Park does. He didn't vote for me, but the reality is somebody has to speak for those folks. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's not industry's job to speak for those folks, necessarily. I can assure you, it is not the bureaucracy's job to speak for the folks. They don't think that is their job. So as these processes become increasingly more complex, I think it's incumbent on local governments to think about how are they going to staff their organizations to be part of all of these processes that have to take place. Because if you're not intimately involved in the planning processes and the EIS processes, your ability to influence the outcome of those processes falls precipitously. It is much, much harder to fix something later than it is to be part of that. And we spent a lot of time trying to bring documentation to a point that it was like readable by shrinking the number of pages and the amount of time it should take to do something. But there has to be, I think you have to really think about, there are people that have, whatever your community's view is, there's somebody at that table that has a different view than your community. And so you need to figure out how to be represented there. And that would be my real takeaway to you, is all of these processes, whether it's, and I have nothing to say about the state government because I don't know it, but I can assure you that the federal government is just getting increasingly more complex every day. And it's going to continue to. And I think you really have to think about how you are going to participate in those processes, because a lack of investment there is harmful to your community on the long term. So that's my big point. Now, here's what I'd be willing to do. We have a lot of time, I guess. I'll take any question about anything. Might be the only chance you ever get to ask a former secretary, but I'd really love to answer any questions you have. But that's my analytical view of the Biden administration, not my policy view, but just looking at where they think. I think they're doing a pretty good job in their first year of implementing their policy vision. So thank you for that, ma'am. Well, you know, truthfully, and maybe this is not the right thing to say, but look, there are processes. I mean, there are lots of processes for you to engage, right? Honestly, you can be a cooperative entity agency on every NEPA document. You know, a lot of it is how much you want to be involved. And the other, which is very significant, is how much the local officer is interested in you being involved, right? And a lot of them are very busy. I mean, in fairness, like they have a lot going on. But the truth of the matter is, I really think you just have to keep pounding on them. That's my subtle solution.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here, Secretary. This is Gary Moyer from Rio Blanco County Commissioner. And I was curious about how you talked about the transition from one administration to another. And could you tell us what some of the biggest challenges are when it comes to a new administration taking over, and how they implement their policies when so many people within the staff of these agencies don't change? Could you talk about how big a challenge that is to get your policies in place?
Well, here's the way to think about it. I'll use Interior as an example. Interior, depending on the time of year, has about 65,000 to 70,000 people employed in it. Of those, about 90 people, max 90 people, are political appointees. So when one administration leaves and a number comes in, you're talking about a change of about 90. And when we did our transition, as part of the Trump team, we spent a lot of time thinking about the team that we were sending in initially. In the Bush administration, I think the transition team was about 4 people, and then they figured out they were going to send like 30 in the first day. What we did is we felt this way. Whoever was going to be the secretary, which turned out to be Ryan Zinke, he was a great guy, Ryan should have the ability to have a certain number of staff that like he knew and was comfortable with. So we gave him about 1/3 of the staff to select. About 1/3 came from the campaign, and then I wanted to send in about 1/3 that had been at the Department of the Interior before. Because oddly enough, these places are complex. And there's policies and protocols, and if you don't know them, you can really make big missteps on day one. But the reality is, and this really does have a point, the reality is the selection of the people you send in initially sends a message to the entire agency. And so one of the guys that went in for us was a wonderful gentleman. He'd served in the Reagan administration, he'd served in the Trump administration, in the Bush administration, both Bush administrations actually. And I wanted him to walk in on day one because I knew that would send a message to everybody that was a senior manager in the Department of the Interior instantaneously. Oh, we have somebody that actually knows what they're doing here. 2, The person actually knows the processes and procedures, and we're about to implement them. And you know, the Trump election was a little unique in that there was a lot of press before it, before the inaugural, on people deciding that they wanted to, quote, resist and do these things. A lot of press reports about that. And so I wanted to have somebody that could go in there and be really clear and understanding of the legitimate role with the staff. Now, at the end of the day, a big difference between my experiences in the Bush administration and the Trump administration was that there were more incidences throughout the administration of folks, you know, fundamentally not like doing actions that were contrary to what the president's policies were. In the Bush administration, you didn't have a lot of that. You had people maybe just wouldn't do something, but it wasn't affirmatively resistance. Now, I also have to tell you that on a personal level, that almost never happened to me. And, you know, I'd been in Interior a long time before. People knew that I knew the law and the procedures. And I thought it was always very important with the staff to basically say, look, I'm going to make the decision, and I'm going to be accountable for the decision. Because at the end of the day, that's like the job of the deputy secretary or the secretary or whoever, whatever role you're playing. And it's my experience that the staff get the most concerned when they have this view that like they have to, you know, that they bear the burden and the responsibility of the decision. And they don't. They shouldn't. They should bear the burden of being informed. During the COVID, I thought I knew a lot about Interior, and then COVID happened. And I was forming this little emergency team. And I found out that we had 98 public health officials in the Department of the Interior, public health officers, which I didn't know about. They'd been at the Park Service for about 100 years, and I wasn't aware of them. So I immediately asked 2 of them to come up and sit by my office for, it turned out, the rest of my tenure, actually. But it was absolutely incredible to have folks who could get me all the information that they had access to. And you know, when I sat down with them, I said, look, I need to know everything about this, and I need to make decisions on it. I'm gonna need your recommendation for everything, but I'll make the decision. I'll be accountable for what we do. And they were incredibly supportive through the whole process. So there are many great employees at Interior, but we have a increasingly number of folks between Bush and Trump who really are affirmatively working contrary to the elected official. And my concern about that for the country is this, that if you get to a point, which I don't think we're at, but I worry about, if you get to a point where if one party is elected, the civil service works one way, and when another party is elected, they work another. What that ultimately is the rejection of the people's vote. I don't have to like whatever, you know, policies a president has, but it's pretty hard to say that president's, you know, if they were transparent about their policies and they won, if they're transparent about their policies and they're consistent with that and implementing them, you know, the next time to deal with that is in the next election. It's not if somebody just doesn't want to do the work. And so hopefully that answers your question, but that was my experience.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jeff Comstock from Moffett County. And I've been doing local government representation of public land issues for over 2 decades. And one of the things that is the most frustrating over lots of time dealing with this is the durability of decisions. I can't tell you how many topics I have revisited over my time. You name it, sage grouse, it could be wilderness characteristics, the list goes on. And I'd really like to understand your perspective, both from a lawyer perspective, because lawsuits trigger a lot of the reasons we revisit topics, as well as just durability and interior decisions on land management. Most of the folks that are on the ground really want to see a decision hold up over time and not be, after the litigation and the true arguments have been dealt with, the decision to be carried out. And it seems like we revisit these topics every so many years. And so any thoughts you could give us on that would be interesting.
That's, I'll give you it works a lot of different ways. One of my first assignments for Gail Norton, I got this case and I thought it was really interesting. So I went to her and I was going to tell her about the case. And I started telling her about the case, and she says to me, I think I worked on that case. And I'm like, oh, and at Brownstein? No. As AG? No. I think I worked on that case at Interior. And I was like, oh, I don't know about that. But then I went back through the file, and sure enough, she had worked on that case. So some things take a really long time. What you're talking about is I think the nature of dealing with government. At the end of the day, if there's vacillating policies, the Secretary has the authority to come up with a new idea. The courts are, on one hand, everybody wants an opportunity to get in front of court and wants to have the opportunity to have their issues heard, and we all believe in that. The courts, in my opinion, are becoming a little increasingly skeptical. If you go back and look at decisions 30 years ago and today, and that's okay. That's the way society is, and people, continually come up with interesting arguments, and that's just part of our system. But it's frustrating to the people that work on those. It's frustrating to the communities, but that's where we are with government. And that's not, I don't see that changing. I've thought in terms of big infrastructure projects. I gave a talk to the solicitor's office once where I bet them I could go through any EIS they gave me and poke holes in it. And because you have a 1,500-page document that 25 people worked on. No one figured out what the left hand was doing from the right hand, and they're a disaster. And the point I was trying to make with them at the time was, let's figure out how to do slightly different documents. And one simple thing that I wanted to do, Jeff, and I did for a few years, they've changed it now, but I decided that we ought to put the cost of the environmental compliance on the cover of every document. And I did that because here's what's going to happen. A judge is going to stand there, and a group of people, no matter what the decision is, a group of people are going to say, this is the worst thing since sliced bread. Complete garbage. And the government's going to stand there and say, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I thought it might be beneficial to say to the judge, look, we can do it over, but we do want you to know it costs $20 million to do it this time, and how much more do you think we're going to get out of it, right? Because at the end of the day, these things have a actual cost of, just a true direct cost. They also have a cost of nothing gets done. And if you go back and look at our country and say, how would you build the interstate system today? You wouldn't. We have issues with pipelines, and this is not a policy statement. This is just a fact. You could not build the interstate highway system today. You couldn't. And and no one would be dumb enough to try, to be honest with you. So that's the reality from my perspective, for what it's worth. I'm not trying to be downer, so I'll tell you the greatest thing to do as Secretary of the Interior is be the designated survivor. That's pretty cool.
Thank you, Secretary, for being here. I'm Bonnie Peterson with Associated Governments of Northwest Colorado. And I have a thank you more necessarily than a question. I just want to thank you for all your assistance in helping us get the annual points money back, because it had gotten lost in a morass back there, and we were having some terrible times, and I don't know if we'd have gotten it if you hadn't been in that position, so thank you.
So well, thank you. I don't know how many people know about this, but in 2009, when I was leaving government, there was a fund of money that was supposed to get distributed. I came back like 8 years later, and it's the same problem, and this is a great problem in government, right? It was a little complex. So the Department of Interior's position was, it was complex, so the best thing you needed to do, the counties needed to do, is go to Congress and get Congress to change the law. And then the complexity would go away. And I call this is a classic thing I've seen a lot in my career. I call it trying to put the dead cat on somebody's porch, okay? Because what you do is you focus on, how do I make this problem not my problem? Rather than, how do you solve this problem? And it turned out that the solution was pretty easy. We needed our lawyers at Interior to go talk to the lawyers at Treasury and explain royalties to them. And this was actually a fund that had been set aside for a cleanup, and the cleanup had occurred. And explain our legal authorities to Treasury a little better, so that Treasury then could figure out in their system how they would make this unusual transaction work. And the issue was, it just didn't fit in any other hole perfectly. So we were able to do it. Well, that took it took 9 years of festering, and then another 12 months or so, like a year. But there's a gazillion of those. When I first sat down with the BLM state directors, my second time back as deputy secretary, they were very frustrated that they would get a project done, they'd get it done, and they'd have to have a Federal Register notice. And they would send the Federal Register notice in the project to DC, and it would take them months, literally months, to get it to move from BLM's office through the department and into the Federal Register. And 90% of the time, the document didn't change very much. So we looked at one of these documents, and we found out that there were 11 different times that it was revised. It went to 31 different offices, and 10 people on average in each office looked at this document. And they were frustrated by it. It's called the surname process. If you ever hear that word, run. Okay? So and maybe you guys have that in local government too, and I'm sure it's just as bad. But here's what I did. I said to the state directors, I said, you're the SES, okay? If you're an SES member and you go onto a military base, they pull out an SES flag and call you, you're the equivalent of a brigadier general. I said, you got a lot of authority, so here's what we're gonna do. You are gonna read your SES document, your EIS document. And you're gonna have a lawyer read it, and you're gonna tell me it's great. And you're gonna send it to me. Now, here's what's gonna happen when it gets to me. I'm gonna read it. 2, I'm gonna have a phone call with everybody in DC that wants to talk to you about it. And then we're gonna ask you questions about it. And if you get through our questions, off the Federal Register you go. And that way, we could send out an email that says, if you'd like to be on the call, great. Because when I looked at how this process had been set up, there's no manual that says, here's why we designed the surname process the way we did. So I had to base it on lore, and here's what I realized. One day, the chief of staff at the Department of the Interior, who's a very important guy if you ask him, is sitting there in a nice office, and he has one of 3 papers. I don't know which three, I mean, I don't know which one he picked up to read the article, but I know it's these three, because in 11 years I've tried to order a different paper and I only can get these three. So it's the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal. He picked up one and he reads it. And he sees an article about the Department of the Interior that he doesn't like. And he's surprised by it. And the worst thing you can do at Interior is surprise the Chief of Staff. So he asks, like, how did this happen? And somebody says to him, it happened because the Federal Register went to the document room and somebody read the Federal Register in the document room and wrote a story. So we actually, at Interior, put it out. And he's like, well, then in that case, I must read all Federal Register notices that go before they go to the Federal Register. Well, I have complete confidence that he had no idea what he was doing when he did that. But he did it. And I think, and this is where I have to start guessing, I think the deputy secretary walked in his office and saw this guy reading and said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm reading Federal Register notices. And the deputy secretary said, well, I'm the deputy secretary. I control operations in the Department of the Interior. You're just a staffer. I need to read it. Once he said that, the solicitor, who's the third ranking official at the department, who has one primary job, which is, besides keeping the secretary out of trouble, read everything that the secretary and deputy sign. So suddenly he says, I need to read it. When that happens, all the assistant secretaries decide they need to read it because they don't need to see what their boss is getting. The minute that happens, the bureau directors do, and then we suddenly ended up with two offices. That's really my reconstruction of what happened. And then that process was in place for like 25 years. And it's not an exaggeration. I mean, it really is about that way. And so there's a lot of the system that can just be, streamlined. But in doing that, it takes effort. Because it's so much easier if you've signed a document with 40 other people. You know what happens when things go sideways? You got 39 other people standing with you, right? And when I took the state directors, I said, let's do it. Now, the first few weeks, they didn't think I read. And after that, they realized it was very awkward to have not read if the boss had read. And they also realized that these documents were too long, too complex. They were they were just completely repetitive. You read the executive summary, which was also chapter 1, which was chapter 4, and suddenly they're just striking pages because they have to read it. Now, here's the interesting thing. What's the purpose of NEPA? Anybody know? Purpose of NEPA? The purpose of NEPA is to better inform a decision maker in the environmental consequences of a decision and ensure there's public participation and have evaluated a reasonable range of alternatives. If nobody reads a document, has that purpose been achieved? And so we went down to much smaller documents as a result of that. That made them easier to read. So anyways, that's why things get stuck sometimes.
You are Ron Milhorn from KMTS Radio. You were diplomatic in your assessment of the Biden administration, but tell me, looking at the big picture, what is your gut feeling about the future of energy, fossil fuels, renewables, and when you mix in climate change policies?
Well, I'll tell you two things. The first is a difference. This is, in my view, how important a strong energy policy is, okay? This is just my personal opinion. In 2008, when oil prices were what they were and gas prices were what they were, I was in a meeting, and as I'm leaving the meeting, there had been Secretary Norton had spent a lot of time trying to open a small area in the Gulf of Mexico for offshore drilling that was about 300 miles from Florida. President Bush, when he campaigned the first time, had made a commitment to not drill off the coast of Florida. which became awkward because his brother was the governor of Florida. And Secretary Norton wanted to have a lease sale out there, so that took a long time to get through. I'm getting to your answer. And as I was leaving a meeting, the president leaned over to the vice president and said, you know, someday, who knows what we're going to have to do to protect Saudi Arabia for our energy crisis, our energy issues. And the vice president, without me missing a beat, said basically, or we might have to develop Florida. Now fast forward to the Trump administration. President Trump utilized aggressively our ability to do LNG transactions. It was a very important component in his national security strategy and his foreign affairs strategy, and he liked it because they were very transactional. And I personally believe that having those additional tools as part of your national security strategy and your foreign affairs strategy, having a robust energy menu to work with and have strong production has a huge effect on what America can do worldwide. And so to begin to go backwards from there makes absolutely no sense from a national security perspective, nor does it make sense to me from an economic perspective. And it's particularly challenging when you move to, I'm not for American energy, for fossil fuels, but I'm for fossil fuels from other countries being produced. That to me is an absolutely ridiculous position. So that's my view of the policy, but my view of the future is great. Because at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe that the world is growing greatly, and people worldwide want to transition forward in their lives. And to do that, they will need fossil fuels. That's a reality. People can quibble about it and people can think about it, but my view is the future requires for a long time traditional forms of energy as well as every other form. And I challenge, when folks say to me, we have the substitute already, I want to know where the jobs will be and where they will specifically support those positions. Because it's very easy to say, I'm for the development of electric vehicles and I'm for the development of critical minerals, hypothetically. But, okay, well, are you for them, 3 miles from here? Right? Find the position where the advocates of these policies have staked out, I'm for this. Because the lack of a substitute to communities is no substitute at all. That's my view. I think I'm probably out of time. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed doing this, and thanks for inviting me, Mr. Sampson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming and joining us. So with that.